Why, hello there. How's it going? Hey, I'd like to take a moment to go ahead and introduce you to the first project of what I am calling the Apotheosis Archive. Chances are that if you are listening to this or watching this, whatever the case may be, you're already kind of familiar with what Apotheosis is, but just in case you aren't, Apotheosis is a text-based RPG wherein you play as a god, and you try to get followers, who in turn will grant you powers based off of what they believe. Kind of runs with the idea that the more followers you have, the stronger your miracles are. But the kicker is that you only start with visions, right? Typically, you only reveal yourself to one person with a vision, and then whatever you say in that vision or cause that person to believe, they can then spread myths about you, which will then in turn grant you hopefully more followers and thus more miracles. But yes, our journey with Apotheosis actually began 10 years ago with a little game called Apotheosis, Aedificatoris, and Absentia. You don't want to know how many times it took me to get that right. It was a game hosted by a user by the name of Dial for the Devil. Great guy. And probably doing what he thought was just a cool idea for a text-based forum game at that time would go on to become so much. But yes, 10 years ago, Apotheosis, Aedificatoris, and Absentia was started on the Speculative Evolution forums hosted by a service called Zeta Boards, if anyone remembers that, on June 15th of 2013. It's pretty incredible, the legacy that has come from Apotheosis. I don't think Dial ever expected it to become as big as it is now. But the game itself, even in that first iteration of the game, would go on to have over 300 posts and as many as 35 players, which may not sound like much, but again, you have to understand this is one game master providing this game for all these different people. And it went on for almost 2 years. And that's another way of looking at it, is that's a lot of growth in that amount of time. And yeah, I think that just kind of tells how awesome that first Apotheosis game was. But again, it did unfortunately end in 2015, but that's not where the story ends. Because with the success of the first Apotheosis and how much people loved it, there was numerous spin-offs and sequel games that came out of that. To the point that 10 years later, the game is still going on very, very strong. In some ways, stronger than it was before, even. And it's actually currently in its 8th generation, a game that is called Apotheosis Sacramentum, much easier to say, which is instead hosted on Discord by another user by the name of Holben, who's, good friends with Dial, and there's certainly no foul play or anything like that. And if I can, throw my hat into the ring a little bit there, I've never hosted a game of Apotheosis. I was briefly considered to be a co-GM for the first one, little known fact there. It didn't go well. That's a story for another day. But I did host a runoff game or a spin-off game with Dial's permission called Deus Plani. Similar idea, play gods. Anyway, that's a story for another day. It also didn't go well in both of its occasions. But this isn't about me. This isn't about any of that. This project is to celebrate Apotheosis, the fact that it is a decade later and people still really care about this stuff. Apotheosis, I know for myself, it was actually very formative to a lot of the weird niche things that I'm in today. For better or worse, it's had a strange impact on my life that I can't ignore. I didn't know what Cthulhu was till I started playing Apotheosis, and the people in that community talked about it. I was like, oh wow, that's so cool. Dial, I know in his early days, mentioned that one of his inspirations for Apotheosis was the roadside picnic story, which is really interesting. And I would have never known about that story, which is influential to so much sci-fi, so much great sci-fi out there, had it not been for Apotheosis. And so it's really cool, the impact that it has. So it's important to me, if nothing else. And I want to do this project not for my own glory or anything like that. I want to do this project as a means of celebrating Apotheosis, And so I can re-enjoy what is to me an old classic, and then maybe share this wonderful thing with a host of new people. So what we are going to be doing for this first project, again, of what I'm calling the Apotheosis Archive, this is going to be an audio recording of the first game through its first Breach Zone expansion. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry. We'll get to what that means when we get to what that means. And so what this is going to entail is it's going to be the player posts followed by the dials, the GM's post at the very end. And that way you can kind of enjoy each round in its original context, of course in audio format, but I will also be including timestamps so that way I only want to follow Epithus, however you pronounce their name. Fun fact, pronouncing names is my biggest struggle with this. But yeah, so that way you can, if you want, you can use the timestamps to follow each god's escapades as well as its what happens to that god. The small deviation in this first episode, at least, is of course that I'm not going to be including the full introduction by Dial. This is no shade to Dial or anything like that, but really that first introductory post, there's a lot of stuff in it that's not super important, which I will be condensing down to give you, this audience, everything you need to know, as well as is so apparent going through and doing this project, these were never meant to be read out loud. They do not always read out loud easily, and praise the liver, the first introductory post was real hard to read. So yeah, we're going to be trimming that up a little bit. I'll give you what you need to know. So how does this game of Apotheosis work? So something to keep in mind as we get into the meat and potatoes. Gods are going to start, basically, they can reveal themselves to a single person. This is generally going to be in the form of a vision, but they also have some light poltergeist type activity they can do. And generally, they're going to give their name and some indication of what they can do. And then after that point, it's up to hoping the person that they've revealed themselves to will go on and do a good job of spreading the word of this new god. As we will see in the game, through later turns, it doesn't always go well. Within the game, there are 4 types of worship. You've got prayer. This is going to be your weakest form of worship, but of course it is the easiest to do and the most widely accepted. People say prayer to you. Cool. You get a little bit of power for that. It's like a little chicken nugget for your god. It's not a feast, but it'll keep him going. Then you've got sacrifice. Sacrifice, that's the whole McRib, right? It is the strongest form of worship your god can get. This game, as we'll get into the setting here in a little bit, animal sacrifice is fairly ubiquitous, and that's not necessarily frowned upon, though really poor people in your society may not be able to do it, so something to keep in mind. Human sacrifice is an option, but, comes with some strings attached, if you will. Can be a little bit unpopular, and other gods can kind of work that and play that against you. Construction. This is going to be the second most powerful form of worship your people can do for you. Basically, this is, you have your people, they go and build a thing for you, boom. That's going to increase your power in that local area. It's pretty cool. You got a permanent monument to yourself. And that can be anything like shrines, temples, so on and so forth. And then finally, we have fear, which this is pretty cool. It's kind of unique to this first Apotheosis game, and we didn't really see it in later games. But fear is power growth, basically. It can, fear is very strong for you, but it also limits you to kind of being a malevolent being. Basically, if you're going around and have people terrified that you're going to cause pillars of fire to fall from the heavens, that's great. Really hard to be flexible and pivot away from that, so you're kind of locked into that play style. But the setting of this game is in ancient Greece. But as Dial points out in this very first post, this is not the Greece of Earth. No. This is the Greece of myth. And it is the dawn of the age of heroes. So think like, Heracles and all this heroic, cool stuff. And as Dial explained in other conversations around this time, the way that you can expect your followers to react to you is kind of what you would expect people to do in the myths of yore, right? But some other interesting things about this time is that there are no empires, there are no towering monuments or marvels in the land, and the land is basically divided up into a whole bunch of warring city-states. So, as they say, chaos can be a ladder. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right on into round 1 of Apotheosis, Aedificatoris in Absentia. Jere 2000. Name, Merchant. I show a traveling merchant who is not poor, but not rich either. He is traveling across the mainland, selling his wares and stories he has heard from all the towns he's traveled to. He's about to go from Olynthus to Potidaea, when I show him a vision. I warn him of bandits hiding on the main route he was planning to take, and tell him to take another path. Which, while it is more out of the way and would be a longer journey, is much safer. I end by telling him it was the god Merchan who gave him this information. Nano, Epithus. A young woman and her baby are cornered with a bear. Suddenly the bear becomes fearful and flees. I have given it a vision of horrible, scary things. The woman, once she is safe, has a vision of a handsome young man. He says to her, I am Epithus, god of fire and life. I have saved the lives of you and your child, so I have a request. Go and tell your people of this, so I may give my blessings to them as well. He then turns into a beetle and flies away. Uru, the Kai. The Kai reveals itself in the form of a dream to the daughter of the king of one of the city-states, of a meteor crashing into a village, that when touched impregnates the women. Then children born to the village all have the same physical characteristics: immense stature, straight black hair, and piercing white eyes. Lamna, Eirene. An infertile huntress receives a vision, telling her to climb into the mountains, drink from a spring, make love to her husband, and sleep next to the spring. Eirene will help her conceive and ensure the pregnancy and birth have no complications. Watcher, Orubashi. The warrior Damjan marches into battle. He fights with bronze and blood, but is struck down by an arrow and slips into darkness upon them. In his dreams, he is visited by a creature of fire and smoke that tells him that it will save him and make sure the battle is won in exchange for his free will. Terrified, he accepts, and the creature, presenting itself under the name Orubashi, tells a tale how he is the true god of Earth. He wants to love and protect all people, but the pretender gods prevent him from doing it. So he orders Damjan to spread his word. The Savior is here! Those that do not listen are usurpers, those who seek to keep the world in disarray. Send those souls to the afterlife, where they shall cause no harm. The conversation goes on for what seems to Damjan many tens of hours. He awakens in a tent, alive and well, seemingly as if no arrow hit him at all. Kamine, Feklu. The spirit of a man beloved by his village rises from the grave, unseen, but still capable of interacting with his world. He leaves a message for his best friend by scrawling words on a rock in a wall in his house. Alongside, he leaves his clothes that he was buried in. The words read, I still walk this plane. Oh, and a drawing of a bee. Vespetum, Valtariberg. Say my name! He has heard that phrase in his mind for the last week now. A teacher on his deathbed, crippled with an illness that should be fatal, stands. He knows to whom he must think. He has heard his voice clearly. Something in Greek. Something in Greek. Now it is the old man's time to talk. He rushes into the town square. He says one word. One powerful word. Valtariberg. Conclusion of round 1. Dial for the devil. Jere, merchant. Follower count of 3. The merchant, who goes by the name of Iktaion, for some reason heeds your warnings and decides to travel the safer route. He curses himself for taking the long route, since by the time he gets there, the ships have already been filled with goods. However, once he arrives at Potidaea, He quickly learns that the merchants had traveled the faster route had been ambushed and massacred by a large pack of bandits. Suddenly, the man for his eyes goes up dramatically, and Icteon makes a huge profit. As a sign of respect, Icteon ties a purple silk band around his right wrist and never removes it. His sons do the same. Miracles! You can now grant premonitions to Icteon. Nano Epithus. Follower count of 1. The woman names her son Epithus, meaning son of Epithus, out of gratitude. The baby seems to glow with a strange but comforting vitality. The woman, it turns out, is a whore who is hiding from the forces of Queen Pelagia of Chalkis. She is carrying the king's bastard son, and only heir since the queen is barren. However, she is cornered at a village, and a group of soldiers prepare to kill her and Epithus. She begs for your help again. Miracles! You can induce multiple powerful visions to those around Epithus. Lamna, Eirene. Follower count 2. The woman's faith in Eirene is so strong that a miracle really does happen. She obeys your commands and soon falls pregnant. The husband is delighted by this and offers the intestines of his kills as a sacrifice to you. The sheer strength of your 2 followers have given you a great miracle. Miracles. You can cause infertile women to become fertile. Watcher, Orubashi. Damjin was a coward. The arrow merely grazed him. He needed an excuse to avoid the next battle against the Greeks who were ravaging his ancestors' homeland in the mountains of Phrygia. However, after his visions, Damjin's eyes seemed as black as coals. The men say they saw him slay 100 Greeks, brutally tearing them apart limb from limb. The battle was an astounding victory. When Damjin returned to camp, he tore down the idols of his companions and told them of Orubashi. The men swore they saw claws swirling around in the darkness around them. The sheer fear that Damjin had felt during the visions had actually caused part of his soul to flee his body and become replaced by an aspect of your god. Miracles! Orubashi can assault those who fear him from the shadows. Damjin is a walking avatar of you. This means he has superhuman strength and is harder to kill. Kamine, unknown. Follower count 1. The dead man's friend writes a message below the message you left. I am sorry, Klitos. Please forgive me. It turns out the living man had married the widow of the dead man. The man interprets the sign of the bee as what you desire, and so leaves pots of honey at the grave of Klitos to placate what he believes is an angered spirit. The fear and sacrifice gives you far greater power. Miracles. You can appear to those who believe in you as an apparition of their deceased. You cannot speak, though, and can only write. Vespitome, Valtariberg. Follower count 20. The teacher, who had been suffering horrifically from leprosy, begins repeating the words, Valtariberg, Valtariberg. Something about the word seems to cause people to stop in their tracks. The people ignore the man's leprosy and flock towards him, offering him food and water. The people ask the man what the meaning of this word is. They eagerly await your response through the teacher. Uru, Kai. Follower count 600. The daughter tells her father, the king of Pylos, about her vision. Pylos had just been sacked by the Spartans, and its firstborn sons had all been killed in response for the king not being able to pay tribute to them. The people are desperate, and so after hearing the vision immediately begin praying for the meteor to arrive. Sheer dogmatism grips the city as the devastated mothers and fathers offer sacrifices of animals to the Kai. They desire to build a temple to you, but they do not know what form you take. Miracles! You can call down that meteor now. One thing I kind of want to play around with this project is potentially going over the round that has just occurred and kind of giving some context to what's gone on, or some analysis, or a comparison to modern games, which I think might be of particular interest to our new audience, because so few of our current players were in the first game and vice versa. So it's kind of interesting. And one thing that immediately is apparent looking at this game is there's a dramatic difference in how the game was played in these early days. You know, even stepping aside from the forum-based nature of it as opposed to the modern Discord-based nature of it, you know, most of these introductions, I think, are like a paragraph at most. The longest one being Watchers with Orubashi. And even then, it's a fairly short couple of paragraphs that he's got going for that. And it's interesting, whereas, I know I'm probably one of the biggest defenders of this in modern Apotheosis. It's all very much like novel writing for the most part, with some exception. I think it really depends on the player. But yeah, their things were much more short and sweet and to the point. And to be fair, like as you'll if I were to include date stamps in this, for a while in the original Apotheosis, there was an update every day. Right, like the players would get their stuff in, cool, boom, Dio got his stuff in the next day, and it just went on like so. Much quicker turnaround, even than what is arguably a breakneck speed for Apotheosis 8 currently. And it's an interesting difference, right? Again, I think it speaks to they weren't really aware of what Apotheosis was going to become at this time. Let's see. Apart from that, we also see a few curious individuals like Vespatum, who plays Valtariberg. If anyone's following along with that and being like, oh man, I like this dude, I want him to win as much as one can win a game like this, I am sorry to say he sticks around for a total of like 4 rounds, and then he evaporates. He becomes no more. Not in-game, but just like he just stops playing, basically. And that is something we'll see from time to time. There is at least another player. I'm not going to give theirs away, because it doesn't apply to the first breach zone, but they stop playing as well, which is kind of sad, but it is what it is. No king rules forever, as it were, which is unfortunately true for the first Apotheosis game. Other than that, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do the video editing on this just yet, but you might notice the names do not necessarily match up, and that's because some of the users' names changed as things went on. Many of them are different now for the still existing players. So I am, for the most part, referring to them with the names that I knew them as when I was involved with this version of Apotheosis and the community. So, like, Taxes but Nano in game, his GM refers to him as Nano Tyrannus. Of course, I knew him as Nano. Right. The other thing, and then there's another character, Kamido, in this. I knew them by a name that they actually didn't like anymore. They find that name offensive as I last spoke to them. So I will be referring to them as the other name I knew them by at this point as Kamine. Thus, Bloom Boy is Watcher, and Urufu Marukai is Uru. And to that end, you'll notice depending on the nature of this video, that I'm definitely blurring out some of the avatars used at this point, because suffice to say, some individuals had a very unique sense of humor, and I don't anyway. If you know, you know. If not, you don't need to know. Don't worry about it. You'll find out when you're older. But anyway, that is going to be it for our first analysis, and we may or may not continue doing this as the game goes on. We shall see. But with that will conclude our first episode of the Apotheosis Anniversary, Apotheosis Archive. I don't know what to call this. Law is made up and the points don't matter. Catch you guys on the next one.